she's been a very mysterious character. I can't think of any Western character whose life has been more obscured by fable and myth. So Pearl Hart in 1899, she and her male companion held up and robbed a stagecoach in Arizona Territory. And she was captured after a 4 or 5 day manhunt in the high desert. She was trying to escape to the railroad line on the Southern Pacific in Benson, Arizona. And before she was able to reach there, a sheriff's posse tracked her down and captured her. She was dressed in men's clothing. She was carrying a Winchester rifle, a brace of pistols. And if you watch TV today, you know, this is very common. You know, most, as we know, a large number of Western outlaws were women. The Old West was heavily populated with cowgirls. And that's what you would believe if you were to watch movies like 1883, and don't get me started. I do love the fact that all these Westerns are coming out today, thank goodness. And honestly, they're no worse than the cockamamie Westerns we watched when we were kids, so I can't complain too much. But there were no cowgirls in the Old West. The cowgirls, if you do a search today, it's so easy to research on newspapers.com or the many other digital newspaper sites, type in the term cowgirl, and the only references are performers in Wild West shows. There were no cowgirls on ranches. Women did not wear men's clothing. One of the speakers mentioned to us a couple days ago, and this is very true. If a woman dressed like a man or vice versa, almost every community had laws against cross-dressing. And if a woman ventured out in men's clothing, she'd be subject to arrest. And the newspapers are filled with accounts of officers arresting women dressed like men and vice versa in the 19th century. And I mention all this because Pearl Hart was unique. People talk about, Belle Starr, the Bandit Queen of Oklahoma. Well, Belle Starr never robbed anybody. She was a consort of outlaws. Catalani and Little Breeches, they were not bandits. They sold liquor to the Indians, and they did dress like men, which is remarkable. That's why the photographs of them are so iconic. But Pearl Hart was the most famous woman outlaw of the Old West. Her capture was featured in newspapers throughout the country in 1899. The headlines were banner headlines. "We have a woman bandit," declared one newspaper on the East Coast. "Girl stage robber caught," was in one of the Arizona, I think the Phoenix newspaper. "Petite and pretty, but full of nerve," said one of the East Coast papers. "A beauty, but a bandit," I think that was in the Boston newspaper. "A highwaywoman," that's from a Canadian newspaper. Newspaper reporters flocked to the Tucson jail where Bob Paul, one of the most famous lawmen of the Old West, close friend of Wyatt Earp, famous to anybody who's familiar with the Wyatt Earp story. He was undersheriff of Pima County and ran the county jail, and he allowed the reporters to come in. He allowed her to dress in her men's clothing, even though they gave her women's clothing to wear. She didn't like it. She thought they were uncomfortable. He gave her weapons, unloaded of course, and allowed all kinds of photographers in to take pictures of her, which is why in my book I must have at least 15, maybe even 20 photographs of Pearl Hart. She was highly photogenic, and she was happy to be photographed. And given all that, it's kind of shocking, I'll go into this later, how she was able to cover her identity. And so we never knew who she was until my book was released. So in 1899, a couple of reporters came in and interviewed her and in her jail cell while she's awaiting trial. And the journalists uniformly noted her physical attractiveness. According to one, she is small and slight, weighs about 115 pounds, and is not bad looking. I wrote another from Phoenix. She is by nature a handsome-looking girl, about medium height. A correspondent for the Los Angeles Times observed, "The woman is under the average size and is distinctly pretty, dainty and pretty. He called her a delicate-looking, little dark-haired woman. She has refined features, a mouth of the true rosebud type, a nose slightly and piquantly retroussé, my French is horrible, and clear blue eyes that would be confiding and baby-like, were there not a few lines that came through, seeing life in its harsher aspects, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So Pearl, as I said, the reporters just flocked. This is an amazing story. Cosmopolitan ran a whole feature story. You know, today it's one of the leading, if not the leading women's magazine, and it was in 1899 as well. And so Pearl Hart stroked her pet Wildcat as she leaned back on the bunk of her cell in the courthouse in Tucson, Arizona Territory. It was 1899, and she was the most infamous woman in America. Journalists and cameramen flocked to the jail, seeking interviews and photographs. They found her a walking contradiction, a petite, attractive young woman who could alternately act like a street ruffian or a feminine ingenue. She dressed in rough cowboy's clothing and carried a pair of 6 guns. Pearl Hart talked tough, smoked cigarettes, drank liquor, used morphine, and had sex with countless men. At the same time, the reporters saw that she was extremely bright, well-spoken, and a voracious reader. She could knit, sew, and write poetry, yet also shoot straight with a heavy Colt's revolver. Americans had never seen or heard of anyone like her. Now, the reporters then asked her for her own story of her life. And this was something that was to confound researchers and historians for 120-something years. And she told them, and we'll go into why, but she told them this story that many people believed. And it's still all over the internet. If you read Wikipedia, you wouldn't even think that the person that I wrote about in my book is the same person Wikipedia is describing as Pearl Hart. So she tells the reporters, when I was but 16 years old, and while still at boarding school, I fell in love with a man I met in the town in which the school was situated. I was easily impressed. I knew nothing of life. Marriage to me was but a name. It did not take him long to get my consent to an elopement. We ran away one night and were married. I was happy for a time, but not for long. My husband began to abuse me, and presently he drove me from him. Then I returned to my mother in the village of Lindsay, Ontario, where I was born. Well, the only true thing about any of that is she was born in Lindsay, Ontario, in the North Woods of Canada. Before long, my husband sent for me, and I went back to him. I loved him, and he promised to do better. I had not been with him 2 weeks before he began to abuse me again. And after bearing up under his blows as long as I could, I left him again. This was just before the World's Fair closed in Chicago in the fall of 1893. And so this kind of story that she told obscured her history. She was trying to protect her family. And what Pearl Hart, her real name was Lily Naomi Davy. She was born in Lindsay, as I mentioned, in 1871. She later obscured her identity and some of these names that are provided for Pearl Hart, they appear in many accounts, and the names that came out, some came from Pearl herself, some were her real names, and some were just invented by so-called researchers or fiction writers and that kind of thing. But the various names that she was known as, in later years after her arrest in 1899, Mrs. Frank Hart, Pearl Bandman, Caroline Hartwell, Pearl Taylor, Mrs. E.P. Keel, Mrs. Earl Lighthawk, and Pearl Bywater. And like I said, some of that's true, some isn't. Her husband is generally given as Bret Hart, Frederick Hart, Frank Hart, William Hart, James Taylor, Dick Baldwin, Harry Boardman, Joe Boot, and Calvin Bywater. Most of that is a total crock. So Pearl is born into this family of 9 children. She's the third born, 1871. Her father is named Albert Davy. Her mother's Anna Duval. She's French-Canadian. Albert Davy is English-Canadian. They're impoverished. The father, Pearl or Lily, I try to refer to her in my book as Pearl so as not to confuse the reader, but her name was Lily until the 1890s. She always said that my father is a worthless wretch. And my book begins with just a horrific, after this amazing tribute we just heard. It's almost tough to talk about this, but maybe I'm here to tell you what happened, so I apologize for going from something very resurrecting in one sense to a topic here that's pretty gruesome. But her father, the book begins with her father is in the North Woods. A young girl named Alice Tibbs is with her father. The father's working in the fields. She goes out into the woods to pick berries. And her dog is about 100 yards away running around in the brush. And suddenly Albert Davy explodes out of the underbrush. He's drunk. He seizes this 14-year-old girl. He starts to rip her clothes off and assault her. And suddenly the dog comes charging at full speed out of the woods, his teeth gnashing, and he just lashes into Albert Davy and savagely chews him up, and this drunken ruffian escapes and is later captured by the local constables and sentenced to a 2-year term in the Toronto penitentiary. That's Pearl Hart's father. Of the daughters, there were 3 sons that lived to adulthood. The daughters were 5 that lived to adulthood. All the girls became prostitutes. Victoria Wilcox and I were talking about this yesterday. There's this sort of myth today among some academics that sex work wasn't a sort of legitimate means for women to attain empowerment, and it was sort of like a colorful and dramatic and sort of acceptable way for women to live their lives in the 19th century. And anybody who's familiar with juvenile court law, my wife, who helped me a lot with this book, she's the longest serving juvenile court judge in California, 20 years. How she did it is beyond me. Anybody who's familiar with young girls, and especially abused young girls, and what leads them into a life of prostitution, couldn't possibly conclude that prostitution is a good thing for young women. All you got to do is read my book. It's heartbreaking what happened to these girls. Pearl, and what's amazing is that, and we'll get into this in a bit, the girls were able to survive this early life that they were subjected to. So Albert Davy gets out of prison. The family eventually moves to Rochester, New York. This is really a bad move, because at this point, just before they move, Albert Davy tries to get his wife to sell the family property. They have dower rights in Canada. She refuses. He threatens to kill her. She flees to a remote cabin. And again, it's a very, very shocking and sad story. The girls are very young. A gang of young Canadian woodsmen breaks in and rapes the mother. And the girls actually see this. And they're in the court testimony. The witness testifies that 2 of the daughters, it's not clear as to which 2, were prostitutes. And these guys were coming to what they thought was a brothel. And when they found out it wasn't, they proceeded to do what they did. These guys all ended up in long terms in the Toronto penitentiary for doing this. So this is this background of Lily Davy. She goes to Rochester, New York with the family. Rochester is a booming industrial city. The Kodak Eastman Company is starting there in the late 1880s. This is when this happens. Numerous cigarette companies are located in Rochester. So the girls get these jobs, legitimate jobs, but soon this sort of this traumatic life that they'd led, their father, it appears pretty plainly that he abused his daughters. They soon need to escape this dysfunctional family that they're living in. And so how do they do that? They're these beautiful young girls. In Lily's case, she and her best friend is her sister Katie. When Lily was 13 and Katie was 11, they cut their hair off short, steal their brother's clothes, pass as boys to avoid unwanted sexual advances. They jump on a freight train, they head east, they land in Ontario, or in Hamilton, which is right on the international line. And they eventually get arrested and return to Rochester. And then Lily, at this time she's 15, she elopes with a 36-year-old man. And her mother manages to find her. She's brought in, she's put in the woman's reform school in Rochester, but she's released very quickly. And just shortly after that, she's still 15 years old, she marries a streetcar conductor named Charles Dean, who's a burglar by nighttime, streetcar conductor by daytime. And Dean, they have a disastrous marriage. Eventually, she and her sister Katie decide to flee. Dean is very abusive to her. And so again, they cut their hair short, they dress like boys. Sound familiar where we're going with this story? They jump a freight train and they have all these adventures. They end up in Chicago, they keep going, they're trying to go west to find this guy Byers that she was in love with, who had returned to the Saskatchewan area of Canada. But they finally land in Windham, Minnesota, and the people take them in. They think they're these two orphan boys. They go to church, but people start to get suspicious because they're too well behaved. They read the Bible, they don't misbehave, and eventually the hotel keeper who took them in, his 12 or 13-year-old son, sees the older daughter Lily undressing, and he yells at her, "I knew it, you're not a boy, you're a girl." And then this whole thing explodes and it gets into newspapers all over the country. I have a wood engraving, I wish I could find the photo, of the two girls dressed in their hobos clothes. They used to call them bindle stiffs, anybody who bummed around the country on a freight car. But this was shocking. It was in newspapers throughout the country. And what's amazing is nobody later put two and two together. Wait a minute, you've got this girl dressing like a boy, and she's having all these adventures, and then 10 years later it happens again. Couldn't that possibly be the same person? Nobody put it together, and it took me, I can explain later, it took me a long time to put the story together. So eventually they are exposed. They steal, they're stealing, they've grown up in this god-awful background. So in addition to working as prostitutes, they also steal, and they get caught stealing, and the town turns on them. The townsfolk had bought them women's clothing and got them into a nice home. And so they were run out of town, taken to the Chicago Erring Women's Institute. And erring means women who erred. It's a home for prostitutes, unwed mothers, that kind of thing. The girls weren't there very long. They took a bed sheet. They're up on the second story. They tie the bed sheet together into a rope. They shimmy down the rope. They escape. There's another manhunt for them. Eventually they're captured and they're returned to Rochester, New York. Katie keeps doing this stuff, and Lily, both of them. But in Lily's case, she ends up, again, dressed in boys' clothing in one of the towns in southern Ontario in Canada. She gets picked up for masquerading in boys' clothing. And she's sentenced to 2 years because of her prior arrests, 2 years in the reformatory for women in Montreal. It's called the Mercer Institute. And she's released in 1890, and by this time Katie's 17. She's running her own brothel in Buffalo, New York, a place called the Hooks, which was the red light district, a brothel. And it was called the Hooks because Buffalo's the end of the canal, the Erie Canal, and the hooks were the big hooks that were used to load and offload the barges on the canal. full of saloons, brothels, that kind of thing. And so the two of them, then when they're bored working in the brothel, the two sisters and their brother go out into the countryside, and they have this kind of scam that they do where they go into a little village, they steal a cow, then they walk it into the next village, sell it to a butcher. He puts it in his barn. They wait till night, go back in the barn, steal the cow, walk down to the next village, and they do this repeatedly until eventually they get arrested for doing this. And so finally, Pearl, and just to point out, the Pearl Hart, she took her name, the most notorious madam in Buffalo at that time was named Pearl Hart, the wife of Joe Hart, who was her saloon keeper and procurer and protector. And there's another word for it I won't use, in mixed company. And so that's where she gets the name Pearl Hart from. And so what she does is she ends up going to the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. She meets Dan Bandman, who's he's a morphine addicted piano player. He plays pianos in red light districts and cheap saloons. His uncle is the most famous Shakespearean actor in North America, also Daniel Bandman. His father is a very well-known mining and railroad engineer, built mines and railroads all over Central and South America. But Dan Bandman, that was too tame for him. He liked the nightlife. And by this time, Lily likes fast men. So she hooks up with Dan Bandman. Eventually, he gets her hooked on morphine, addicted to smoking opium. He's very abusive. She finally flees and ends up in Arizona Territory. And she's basically got about a 6th grade education. She becomes a prostitute in what's called Block 41, which is the red light district of Phoenix. She's also a prostitute in Gay Alley in Tucson. I don't think it exists anymore, if I remember right. It's got a different name. And she's arrested a number of different times. Finally, Dan Bandman joins the Army at the outbreak as a musician, not as a fighting man, at the outbreak of the Spanish-American War. And that's when Pearl hooks up with Joe Boot, and they hold up the Stagecoach. She claims it's to get money to go back to her mother. There's a lot of other details that would take a long time to go into, and I'll kind of skip over those. But essentially, after robbing the stage, she tells, and she's captured, she tells reporters, "I shall never submit to be tried under a law that neither me nor any of my sex had any role in making." And she's sort of held up as this feminist icon, because this is the beginning of the suffragette era, women's suffrage, the right to vote. And so this created a sensation. She's very bright. She had a 6th grade education, but your education doesn't always dictate how smart you are, right? So she is lodged in the Tucson jail. What does she do? She seduces her trustee, who's like a jail janitor serving a term. They jump on a freight train. They end up in New Mexico, in Deming. George Scarborough, one of the most famous lawmen of the Old West, the man who killed John Wesley Hardin, captures her, returns her, and she's got this wonderful sense of humor. And she's interviewed by a reporter, and she's complaining about how she was handcuffed to the trustee, Ed Hogan. And bear with me a second. So when the Scarborough bundled the manacled pair onto a passenger car and the train headed for Tucson, later she described this incident. "The officers put us in one of those little wooden jails that an ordinary wind could blow away." This is in Deming. "Then they chained our feet together and fastened them to the floor. Outside of the jail and all around the building, they stationed 50 rough-looking men, each with 2 revolvers in his hip pocket. Being chained together in that way was worse than being married." So she eventually lands in Yuma Penitentiary. There's a lot of cockamamie stories about her in Yuma. I don't have time to debunk all those. She ends up being released shortly after the turn of the century. She serves about 3 years. She also, I'll just read a brief section about her stage robbery partner and her sense of humor. Joe Boot is the name of the guy. We don't know his real name. Gene and I have tried to figure it out without any success. But she didn't think much of Joe Boot. And she, bear with me 1 second. I'm trying to read my notes so I don't ramble too much. She tells reporters, "I shall make no defense. I don't care what the world does with me. I'd do it all over again if I had the chance." Referring to Joe Boot, she declared, "Why, the fellow hadn't an ounce of sand. When I was going through the passengers, his hands were shaking like leaves, and he a-holding the guns too. Why, if I hadn't more nerve than that, I'd jump off the earth." So after she gets out of Yuma, she has a long life. She's not Pearl Bywater. There's this crazy story. I can talk to people about that later. She ends up getting married to kind of a useless snake oil salesman named Earl Lighthawk. They have a daughter. The daughter has her granddaughter, great-granddaughter, is still alive, actually. She ends up leaving him. He actually marries a 15-year-old girl while he's still married to Pearl Hart. She ends up in Los Angeles, has many adventures over the years, and dies in East Los Angeles. The house is still standing in 1935. Her sister Katie had even more adventures. A lot of people have read the book, wish I could write a book about Katie Davy, but Katie was a pioneer balloonist in Texas. She would go up in a balloon, jump out in a parachute. She did this in San Antonio and in Austin before huge thousands of people. It's in all the newspapers. She was a screenwriter, an actress. At one point she's in Omaha. She was absolutely stunning. I have photos of her in the book. There's 3 guys after her at the same time. This kind of not even a love triangle, it's a love quadrangle, I guess. And she ends up, one of the guys shoots her, a jealous lover shoots her in the chest. She survives, she carries the bullet. When she dies in 1955, the autopsy shows she's still got that bullet in her. And then he kills himself right in front of a group of people. So Katie Davy eventually ends up many adventures. When she's 42, she tells this Jewish attorney that she marries in Chicago. She has a huge house, 3-story home. I've got a photograph of it in the book. She's very successful. And so the girls were able to overcome this life of prostitution, and they became middle-class housewives. And in Katie's case, she was very popular in Hollywood. She was a screenwriter. She bought a home that unfortunately doesn't stand anymore in the Silver Lake area of LA. She would commute back and forth in the 20s and 30s. She wrote screenplays. She wrote a novel in the early 1940s. And I say in the book, I wish she could have written a factual biography of her life. No one would believe it. And she finally died in 1955. The point I was going to make about the marriage, she tells the attorney she's 42. On the marriage license, he's 25, she's 24, and I've got their wedding photo in the book, and she's 42, and she looks like she's 24. So that's sort of the nutshell version of the real Pearl Hart. Anybody has a few questions, I'm happy to answer them. And I will say that Gene and I talked for years about who she was, and we both had shared our research and everything. And the way that I managed to figure it out is just by spending, and I love to do research, but just mind-numbing searches on the internet. And I found that various members of the family used the last name Davy. And then I found what looked like might have been her actual name in an arrest record, Lily. And then I thought, well, maybe she's telling the truth about Lindsay, Ontario. So I finally, like a numbskull, I finally go look at the Lindsay census, and sure enough, all the brothers and sisters that I'd been able to find. Occasionally the brothers would be arrested. Supposedly this guy is Pearl Hart's brother. In every case it turned out to be true, and that's how I uncovered the Davy family. And then finally I end up having this brainstorm, well, why don't I contact the librarians in Lindsay, Ontario? And after doing months of work, these wonderful librarians send me this big, thick packet of the Davy family. They figured out who Pearl Hart was 2 or 3 years earlier. And I could have saved myself all this work if I just tried to contact the librarians. So thank goodness for librarians. So thank you very much.